The smell of fresh garlic and herbs filled the air as David walked through his restaurant for the evening inspection. 23 years ago, he had started with nothing but a dream and a small loan from his uncle. Now, Angelo's Kitchen was one of the most popular dining spots in downtown, with customers driving from across the city just to taste his famous lasagna. David straightened a crooked picture frame on the wall and smiled. The restaurant was his life's work, built on the simple belief his grandmother had taught him growing up in her kitchen. "Treat everyone like family," she used to say while rolling out pasta dough. "Rich or poor, young or old, everyone deserves to feel welcome at our table." Those words had guided him through every decision over the years. When he hired staff, he looked for people who understood that serving food was about more than just taking orders. It was about creating moments of joy, comfort, and connection. At least that's what he thought he had built. Lately, though, something had been bothering him. It started 3 months ago when Mrs. Peterson, a regular customer for over a decade, pulled him aside after dinner. She was hesitant at first, clearly uncomfortable about bringing up the topic. "David, I love coming here," she had said, glancing around nervously. "But I have to tell you something that happened last week. I brought my nephew here for his birthday. He's going through a rough patch, lost his job, and doesn't have much money for nice clothes. The way your staff treated him..." She paused, shaking her head. "It wasn't the Angelos I know and love." David had listened carefully as she explained how the hostess had seated them at the worst table in the restaurant, near the kitchen door, where servers constantly bumped into their chairs. The waiter had been cold and dismissive, barely making eye contact with her nephew throughout the meal. When they asked for more bread, the server had rolled his eyes and taken 20 minutes to return with stale rolls. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Mrs. Peterson had finished. "I just thought you should know." That conversation had stuck with David like a thorn in his side. He started paying more attention to what happened around him, but here was the problem. Whenever he was in the dining room, his staff was on their best behavior. They smiled brighter, moved faster, and treated every customer like royalty. It was impossible to see what really happened when he wasn't watching. 2 weeks later, another incident came to his attention. This time, it was through an online review that made his stomach drop. A young mother had written about bringing her elderly father to the restaurant for Father's Day. The old man used a walker and moved slowly, which apparently annoyed their server. According to the review, the waitress had sighed loudly when taking their order and made no effort to help when the elderly man struggled to read the menu in the dim lighting. "My father felt so unwelcome that he asked to leave before we even finished our appetizers," the review stated. "This used to be our favorite restaurant, but we won't be back." David had immediately called the customer to apologize and offer a free meal, but the damage was done. More importantly, he realized this wasn't just a single bad employee having a bad day. There seemed to be a pattern developing, and it was breaking his heart. The restaurant business was tough, no doubt about it. Staff worked long hours for modest pay, dealing with demanding customers and endless pressure. David understood that everyone had bad days, but what he was hearing went beyond occasional mistakes or stress-related slip-ups. It sounded like some of his employees had started judging customers based on their appearance and treating people differently because of it. Over the next few weeks, David tried different approaches to address the problem. He held staff meetings about customer service standards. He sent out reminder emails about treating all guests with respect. He even offered bonuses for exceptional customer service reviews. Nothing seemed to make a real difference, probably because he still couldn't see the actual behavior that needed to change. The breaking point came on a busy Saturday night. David was in his office reviewing inventory reports when he heard raised voices from the dining room. He stepped out to see what was happening and found one of his servers arguing with a customer near the front door. The customer was a middle-aged man in worn work clothes, clearly upset about something. "All I wanted was to surprise my wife for our anniversary," the man was saying, his voice shaking with emotion. "I saved up for 3 months to bring her here, and you're telling me I can't get a table because I don't look appropriate for your establishment?" David's face burned with embarrassment and anger. He immediately intervened, personally seating the couple at one of the best tables and ensuring they received outstanding service for the rest of the evening. But the damage was done. Other customers had witnessed the confrontation, and he could see the judgment in their eyes. That night after the restaurant closed, David sat alone in his office staring at the framed photo of his grandmother on his desk. She had passed away 5 years ago, but he could almost hear her voice asking, "Is this really the restaurant you wanted to build, David?" The truth was painful to admit. Somewhere along the way, his dream restaurant had developed an ugly side that went against everything he believed in. His staff was making assumptions about people based on how they dressed or how much money they appeared to have. They were forgetting that behind every customer was a human being with their own story, struggles, and reasons for wanting to enjoy a nice meal. David knew he had to do something drastic to understand the full extent of the problem. Regular observations weren't working because his presence changed how everyone behaved. He needed to see his restaurant through the eyes of someone his staff might judge and dismiss. He needed to experience firsthand what it felt like to be treated as less than worthy of respect and kindness. As he locked up the restaurant that night, an idea began forming in his mind. It was risky and would require careful planning, but it might be the only way to truly understand what was happening in his own business. If his staff was judging people based on appearances, then he would have to change his appearance completely. David looked at his reflection in the restaurant's front window. In his expensive suit and polished shoes, he looked every inch the successful business owner he had become. But what if he didn't? What if he walked into his own restaurant looking like someone who had fallen on hard times? Would his own employees treat him with the dignity and respect he expected them to show every customer? The plan that formed in his mind that night would test not only his staff, but also his own heart. He had no idea that the results would challenge everything he thought he knew about the people working for him, and ultimately change his life in ways he never expected. David stood in front of his bathroom mirror at 5 in the morning, hardly recognizing the person staring back at him. 3 days of planning had led to this moment, and now he was having second thoughts about the whole idea. The transformation he was about to undergo felt almost like betraying his own identity, but he knew it was the only way to uncover the truth. He had spent the previous day shopping at thrift stores across town, carefully selecting clothes that would make him look like someone who had been struggling for months. The jeans had holes in the knees and paint stains that wouldn't wash out. The jacket was too big with frayed sleeves and a broken zipper. The shoes were scuffed beyond repair, with soles so thin he could feel every crack in the sidewalk. But clothes alone wouldn't be enough. David had researched his disguise like an actor preparing for the most important role of his life. He had visited homeless shelters as a volunteer years ago, and he remembered the small details that told stories of hardship, the way people carried themselves when they had nowhere to go, the look in their eyes when they felt invisible to the world. He started with his hair, using gel to make it look greasy and unwashed. Then he rubbed dirt under his fingernails and on his hands, the way they might look after weeks without proper facilities for cleaning. A small tube of theater makeup helped him create dark circles under his eyes and hollow-looking cheeks. He practiced hunching his shoulders and walking with the slow, careful steps of someone whose feet hurt in ill-fitting shoes. The hardest part was changing his voice and mannerisms. David was used to speaking with confidence, making eye contact, and taking up space in a room. Now he had to become someone who apologized for existing, who spoke quietly and avoided drawing attention. He practiced in front of the mirror until the character felt natural. By the time he was finished, even his own mother wouldn't have recognized him. The successful restaurant owner was gone, replaced by someone society often chose not to see. David felt strange in his own skin, but he was committed to seeing this through. The plan was simple. He would enter the restaurant during the busy dinner rush when his staff would be focused on their work and less likely to pay close attention to one customer. He had called in sick that morning, telling his assistant manager he had food poisoning and wouldn't be in for the entire day. This would ensure no one expected to see him around. At 6:30 that evening, David walked slowly down the street, toward his own restaurant. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure people could hear it. The familiar neon sign that usually filled him with pride now seemed intimidating. He pie, used across the street, watching customers in nice clothes walking confidently through the front door. Taking a deep breath, David crossed the street and approached the entrance. Through the windows, he could see the warm glow of candle-lit tables and the bustling energy of a successful dinner service. For a moment, he almost turned around. This felt wrong, like spying on his own family. But then he remembered Mrs. Peterson's nephew and the elderly man with the walker. He thought about the couple celebrating their anniversary who had been turned away at the door. Those people deserved better, and the only way to ensure they got it was to understand exactly what they had experienced. The hostess looked up as David approached the front desk. Her name was Jessica, a college student he had hired 6 months ago. She had always seemed sweet and professional during his interactions with her, but now her expression changed completely when she saw him. Her smile disappeared instantly, replaced by a look of barely concealed disgust. She glanced around nervously as if hoping someone else would handle the situation for her. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cold and unwelcoming. She stood behind the podium like it was a barrier protecting her from contamination. "I'd like a table for dinner, please," David said quietly, keeping his eyes down the way he had practiced. Jessica hesitated for a long moment, clearly uncomfortable. "We're very busy tonight," she said finally. "I'm not sure we have anything available." David could see over her shoulder into the dining room. At least 6 tables were empty, and he knew from experience that Tuesday nights were never fully booked. His heart sank as he realized what was happening. "I can wait," he said softly. "I have money to pay." He pulled out a crumpled $20 bill from his pocket, money he had deliberately made look worn and dirty. The sight of the money seemed to change Jessica's calculation. After another uncomfortable pause, she grabbed a menu and said, "Follow me." But instead of leading him to one of the nice tables by the windows or in the main dining area, she walked him to the very back of the restaurant. The table she chose was right next to the swinging doors that led to the kitchen. Every few seconds, servers rushed past carrying trays of food. The lighting was dim, and the table wobbled when David tried to rest his arms on it. It was the worst seat in the house, the table they usually used for extra storage during slow periods. "Someone will be with you shortly," Jessica said without making eye contact, then hurried away as fast as she could. David sat alone at the wobbly table, watching the restaurant he had built with his own hands from a perspective he had never imagined. The energy and warmth he felt so proud of seemed distant from this dark corner. He could hear laughter and conversation from the main dining room, but here he felt isolated and forgotten. 25 minutes passed before anyone approached his table. David watched as servers took care of customers who had arrived after him, bringing them bread baskets and taking their drink orders with smiles and enthusiasm. Meanwhile, he sat with his hands folded, trying to make himself as small and unnoticeable as possible. When a server finally came over, David recognized him as Robert, a young man who had been working at the restaurant for almost 2 years. Robert was usually energetic and friendly, someone David had considered promoting to a leadership position. But the person standing beside his table now seemed like a different human being entirely. Robert kept his distance, standing several feet away from the table as if David might be contagious. His usual bright smile was nowhere to be seen, replaced by an expression of impatience and annoyance. "What do you want?" Robert asked bluntly, not even bothering with a proper greeting. David looked up at the young man he had mentored and trained, seeing him with completely new eyes. "Could I please have some water and maybe look at the menu?" he asked quietly. Robert sighed loudly, making sure David knew this was an inconvenience. "Water's free, but you have to order food if you want to stay. This isn't a charity." He tossed a menu onto the table without care, causing the silverware to rattle. As Robert walked away without bringing the water, David felt something break inside his chest. This wasn't just poor customer service. This was cruelty disguised as professionalism. The young man he had trusted and believed in was treating another human being as if they didn't deserve basic dignity. The water, when it finally arrived 15 minutes later, was served in a plastic cup instead of the glass tumblers every other customer received. Robert slammed it down so hard that water splashed onto the already stained table. David stared at the plastic cup, understanding for the first time what it felt like to be judged, dismissed, and dehumanized by people who didn't know his story. The pain was deeper than he had expected, cutting through years of confidence and success to reach something vulnerable and raw inside him. But this was only the beginning. As the evening continued, David would discover that the problems in his restaurant ran even deeper than he had feared, and that the solutions would require more than just new policies or training sessions. They would require a fundamental change in how his staff saw the world and their place in it. David sat in the dim corner of his own restaurant, staring at the plastic cup of water that had taken nearly half an hour to arrive. The ice had already melted and the water tasted stale. Nothing like the fresh, filtered water he insisted be served to every customer. He was beginning to understand that what he thought he knew about his restaurant was just an illusion. From his isolated table, he had a clear view of the main dining room, where families and couples enjoyed their meals in the warm, welcoming atmosphere he had worked so hard to create. The contrast was striking. While other customers received fresh bread baskets within minutes of being seated, David had been sitting there for 45 minutes without so much as a cracker. He watched Robert move between tables with practiced efficiency, his whole demeanor changing depending on who he was serving. With a well-dressed elderly couple at table 12, Robert was all smiles and attention, refilling their wine glasses before they even asked and making recommendations with genuine enthusiasm. At table 15, where a young family was celebrating what looked like a birthday, he brought out a special dessert with a candle and helped them take photos. But when Robert's path took him near David's table, his expression shifted to one of irritation and disgust. He would glance over with obvious annoyance as if David's very presence was ruining his evening. Once, when David tried to make eye contact to ask about ordering food, Robert deliberately looked away and walked faster. The worst part wasn't just being ignored. It was overhearing the conversations between staff members as they passed his table. They spoke about him as if he couldn't hear them, or worse, as if he didn't matter enough for them to care whether he heard. Why did Jessica even seat him? David heard one server whisper to another as they walked past carrying trays. He's going to stink up the whole section. Probably just wants to use the bathroom and then leave without ordering anything, the other replied. I've seen his type before. They come in looking for handouts. David's hands trembled as he gripped the plastic cup. These were people he had hired personally, people he had trusted to represent his values and his family's legacy. Yet they were talking about a fellow human being with such casual cruelty that it made him feel sick to his stomach. The irony wasn't lost on him that these same employees had sat in his office during their interviews, promising to treat every customer with respect and kindness. They had told him they understood that good service meant making everyone feel welcome. Now he was seeing what they really believed when they thought no one important was watching. As the evening wore on, David's treatment only got worse. When he finally managed to flag down Robert to place an order, the server's attitude was openly hostile. About time, Robert muttered, pulling out his order pad with exaggerated impatience. What do you want? And don't order anything expensive if you can't pay for it. David had planned to order one of the less expensive items to maintain his disguise, but Robert's assumption that he couldn't afford a proper meal stung deeply. I'd like the chicken parmesan, please, he said quietly. It was a mid-priced item, nothing extravagant. Robert looked skeptical. That's $18. You sure you have that much? The question hit David like a slap. In all his years of running the restaurant, he had never imagined that his staff would interrogate customers about their ability to pay. It was humiliating and completely against every principle he had tried to instill in his team. Yes, I have the money, David replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert shrugged and scribbled something on his pad. Kitchen's backed up. It'll be at least an hour, he said, though David could see plates of food coming out of the kitchen at a steady pace for other tables. When Robert walked away, David caught sight of the order ticket he had written. Instead of chicken parmesan, it simply said, "Cheap guy, table 23, watch him." The casual cruelty of it made David's chest tighten with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. Over the next hour, David watched his restaurant operate from the perspective of someone deemed unworthy of basic human decency. He saw servers rolling their eyes when they thought he wasn't looking. He heard them making jokes about his appearance and speculating about his life story, none of which were kind or generous. The hostess, Jessica, walked past his table several times, and each time she would wrinkle her nose in disgust, even though David had made sure to shower thoroughly before his disguise. Her reaction wasn't based on any actual smell or disturbance he was causing. It was pure prejudice based on his appearance. When families with children walked near his table, he noticed that parents would subtly steer their kids away from him, influenced by the staff's obvious discomfort with his presence. The message was clear. He was someone to be avoided, someone who didn't belong in this nice establishment. The food, when it finally arrived after an hour and 20 minutes, was clearly not fresh. The chicken was dry and tough, obviously reheated from an earlier preparation. The pasta was overcooked and mushy, and the sauce had a skin on top that indicated it had been sitting under heat lamps for far too long. It was food that David would never have allowed to leave his kitchen under normal circumstances. Robert dropped the plate in front of him without ceremony, causing some of the sauce to splash onto the table. "Enjoy," he said sarcastically, already walking away before David could respond. As David forced himself to eat the substandard meal, he felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had discovered. This wasn't just a few employees having bad attitudes. This was a systematic failure of the culture he thought he had built. His staff had developed their own hierarchy of who deserved good service and who didn't, based entirely on superficial judgments about appearance and social status. The most painful realization was that this had probably been going on for months, maybe even years, while he remained blissfully unaware in his office or during his carefully scheduled walks through the dining room. How many customers had been treated this way? How many people had left his restaurant feeling humiliated and unwelcome? He thought about his grandmother's words about treating everyone like family. If this was how his staff treated family members who were going through hard times, then they had completely missed the point of everything he had tried to teach them. But the evening wasn't over yet. As David sat there processing the full scope of the problem, he had no idea that he was about to witness something that would challenge his growing despair. Someone in his restaurant still remembered what kindness looked like, and her actions would soon remind him that not everything he had built was broken. The night was far from over, and the most surprising moment was yet to come. What happened next would not only shock David, but would also show him that sometimes the most profound lessons come from the most unexpected sources. In a few minutes, his entire understanding of his restaurant and his staff would be turned upside down in ways he never could have imagined. David pushed the dry chicken around his plate, barely able to swallow another bite. The reheated food tasted like cardboard, but that wasn't what was making his stomach turn. It was the crushing weight of disappointment in what his restaurant had become. He had spent 2 hours experiencing treatment that no human being should ever have to endure, and he was beginning to lose hope that any of his staff remembered what compassion looked like. The dining room around him buzzed with warmth and laughter, but from his dark corner, it all felt like a cruel joke. He watched families sharing stories over fresh bread, couples holding hands across candlelit tables, and friends celebrating special occasions with genuine joy. This was the atmosphere he had dreamed of creating, but apparently it only existed for people who looked like they belonged. David was about to ask for his check and end this painful experiment when he noticed movement at the edge of his vision. Someone was approaching his table, but the footsteps were different from the heavy, reluctant trudging he had grown accustomed to from Robert and the other servers. Looking up, he saw Linda walking toward him with a warm smile. She was one of his longest-serving employees, a woman in her early 50s who had been with the restaurant for almost 8 years. David had always respected Linda's work ethic and professionalism, but he had never paid close attention to how she interacted with customers. Now, as she approached his forgotten corner table, he held his breath. "Good evening," Linda said gently, her voice carrying none of the coldness or impatience he had experienced all night. I'm so sorry you've been waiting so long. I just noticed you sitting here, and I wanted to make sure you're being taken care of. David looked up at her in surprise. Her eyes held genuine warmth and concern, not the judgment and disgust he had seen from everyone else. She wasn't standing far away like the others. Instead, she came close to the table and spoke to him like she would speak to any valued customer. The service has been fine, David said quietly, not wanting to get anyone in trouble, even though they deserved it. Linda's observant eyes took in the scene before her. She noticed the plastic cup instead of a proper glass, the cold and unappetizing food on his plate, and the way he had been isolated in the worst corner of the restaurant. Her expression grew troubled. "This doesn't look fine to me," she said, softly. "Let me get you some fresh water in a proper glass, and how about some warm bread from the kitchen? The good stuff, not the day-old rolls." Before David could protest, Linda was already moving. She returned quickly with a crystal glass filled with ice-cold filtered water and a basket of the restaurant's signature warm garlic bread that was still steaming from the oven. The bread that other customers received automatically, but that he had been denied all evening. "There we go," she said, setting everything down carefully. "Much better." David took a sip of the fresh water and felt tears threatening to form in his eyes. It wasn't just about the drink. It was about being treated like a human being for the first time all evening. Linda's simple act of kindness felt like a lifeline in an ocean of cruelty. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice barely steady. Linda studied his face with the kind of attention that comes from years of reading people's emotions. "You look like you've had a rough day," she said gently. "We all go through tough times. That's no reason for anyone to treat you poorly." She glanced around the dining room, and David could see her taking note of how the other staff had been behaving. Her jaw tightened slightly, and he realized she was angry on his behalf. "I'm going to talk to the kitchen about getting you a fresh meal," Linda said. "That chicken looks like it's been sitting under the heat lamps for hours. No one should have to eat that." "You don't have to do that," David said quickly. "I can pay for what I ordered." Linda shook her head firmly. "This isn't about payment. This is about doing what's right. Everyone who walks through these doors deserves a good meal and respectful service regardless of their circumstances." As she walked toward the kitchen, David watched her with a mixture of amazement and relief. After hours of feeling invisible and unwanted, Linda had seen him as a person worthy of care and attention. She hadn't asked questions about his situation or made assumptions about his ability to pay. She had simply recognized that he was being treated unfairly and had stepped in to make it right. 10 minutes later, Linda returned with a plate that looked nothing like the sad meal David had been served earlier. The chicken was golden and crispy, clearly fresh from the grill. The pasta was perfectly cooked and the sauce was rich and aromatic. It was accompanied by a side of fresh vegetables and a small garden salad he hadn't even ordered. "Now this is what our food should look like," Linda said with satisfaction, setting the plate down with care. "I had the kitchen prepare this especially for you." David stared at the beautiful meal in front of him, overwhelmed by the stark contrast between Linda's treatment and what he had experienced from everyone else. "How much will this cost?" he asked, remembering his role. Linda waved her hand dismissively. "Don't worry about that right now, just enjoy your dinner." As David took his first bite of the properly prepared chicken, Linda lingered nearby, refilling his water glass and making sure he had everything he needed. Her attention wasn't hovering or uncomfortable. It was the kind of attentive service that made customers feel valued and cared for. "This is delicious," David said, and he meant it. It was the food he remembered from his own kitchen, prepared with skill and served with pride. Linda beamed at his compliment. "I'm glad you're enjoying it. Food tastes better when it's made with care and served with respect." Throughout the rest of his meal, Linda checked on him regularly. She brought him fresh bread when his basket emptied, refilled his water without being asked, and even brought him a small cup of the restaurant's premium coffee, explaining that it was a special blend they served to mark the end of a good meal. But Linda's kindness extended beyond just good service. David noticed that she was equally attentive to other customers who might be overlooked by the rest of the staff. When an elderly man at another table dropped his napkin, she quickly retrieved it and made sure he was comfortable. When a young couple seemed confused by the menu, she patiently explained the dishes and made recommendations based on their preferences. Most remarkably, David observed Linda quietly helping other customers who appeared to be struggling financially. She would suggest the most filling options at reasonable prices, bring extra bread without being asked, and never make anyone feel ashamed about their circumstances. She had clearly been doing this for years, creating pockets of warmth and dignity in what David now realized had become a cold and judgmental environment. As the evening wound down, Linda brought David a small slice of tiramisu, his restaurant's signature dessert. "On the house," she said with a wink. "Everyone deserves something sweet to end their day." David looked up at this remarkable woman who had restored his faith in humanity during one of the darkest nights of his life. Linda had no idea she was serving the owner of the restaurant. She had no reason to treat him well except for her own moral compass and genuine kindness. In a place where other employees had forgotten their humanity, Linda had remembered hers. As he savored the creamy dessert, David realized that his experiment had revealed more than just the problems in his restaurant. It had also shown him that the values he held dear were still alive in at least one person. Linda represented everything he had hoped his restaurant would stand for, and tomorrow he would make sure she knew how much her kindness meant to someone who needed it most. David left the restaurant that night with his heart heavy but his mind made up. Linda's kindness had saved him from complete despair, but it had also highlighted just how far his other employees had strayed from the values he thought he had instilled in them. He spent the entire night planning what he would say and do the next morning. At 8 a.m. sharp, David walked into his restaurant through the front door, back in his usual business suit and polished shoes. The transformation was so complete that none of his arriving staff recognized him as the man they had treated so poorly the night before. He watched their faces carefully as they greeted him with their usual professional smiles, the same people who had shown such cruelty just hours earlier. "Good morning, Mr. David," Jessica called out cheerfully as she arranged menus at the hostess station. The same woman who had reluctantly seated him in the worst corner of the restaurant now beamed at him with respect and enthusiasm. Robert was setting up tables for the lunch service, whistling a tune as he worked. When he saw David, he straightened up and gave a friendly wave. "Morning, boss. Hope you're feeling better. That food poisoning sounded awful." David nodded politely but said nothing. The contrast between their current behavior and what he had witnessed the night before was so stark, it made him feel sick all over again. These weren't bad people, he realized. They were people who had lost their way, who had forgotten that every customer was someone's family member, someone's friend, someone worthy of basic human decency. Linda arrived for her shift at 9:30, greeting David with the same warm smile she had given to a stranger in torn clothes the night before. She was consistent in her kindness, treating everyone with the same level of respect and care. Watching her interact with the other staff, David could see that her values hadn't changed over the years. She was still the same person who had made a difficult night bearable for someone she thought needed help. "Linda, could you gather everyone in the back dining room, please?" David asked. "I need to have a staff meeting before we open for lunch." Within 15 minutes, all 12 employees who had been working the previous evening were assembled around two pushed-together tables. David stood at the head of the group, looking at each face carefully. Some looked curious, others seemed nervous about the unexpected meeting. Linda sat quietly with her hands folded, her expression calm and attentive. "I want to talk to you all about something that happened last night," David began, his voice steady but serious. "It's about how we treat our customers and what that says about who we are as people." He paused, watching their reactions. A few employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but most looked puzzled about what was coming. "Last night I discovered that some of you have been treating certain customers differently based on how they look or how much money you think they have. This is completely unacceptable and goes against everything this restaurant stands for." Robert and Jessica exchanged glances, both looking increasingly uncomfortable. David could see the wheels turning in their minds, wondering if someone had complained about their behavior. "But instead of just telling you what I heard," David continued, "I want to show you something." He reached into a bag he had brought with him and pulled out the torn jacket, the stained jeans, and the scuffed shoes he had worn the night before. The room fell completely silent as recognition slowly dawned on several faces. Jessica gasped audibly, her hand flying to cover her mouth. Robert's face went pale, and several other servers looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. The pieces were falling into place, and they were beginning to understand the magnitude of what had happened. "Last night I sat in this restaurant for over 3 hours," David said, his voice growing stronger with emotion. "I was ignored, insulted, served terrible food, and treated like I was less than human. Some of you made jokes about me. Others questioned whether I could afford to pay for my meal. I was given the worst table, the worst service, and food that I would never allow to leave this kitchen under normal circumstances." The silence in the room was deafening. Robert looked like he might be sick, and Jessica had tears forming in her eyes. Several other employees stared at the table, unable to meet David's gaze. "I want you to understand something," David continued. "The person you treated so poorly last night owns this restaurant. But more importantly, he was a human being who deserved your respect regardless of who he was or what he looked like." He let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "However, this story isn't just about the failures I witnessed. It's also about something beautiful that happened, something that reminded me why I opened this restaurant in the first place." David turned to Linda, who was looking confused but not worried. Unlike the others, she had nothing to fear from this revelation. "Linda, you have no idea what your kindness meant to me last night. You saw a customer being treated poorly, and you stepped in to make it right. You didn't know who I was, and you didn't care. You saw someone who needed help, and you helped them. You served me food prepared with care, you treated me with dignity, and you made me feel like I mattered." Linda's eyes widened as she realized what David was telling her. "That was you?" she whispered. "Yes, that was me. And your actions last night reminded me that the values I tried to build this restaurant on are still alive, at least in some people. You represent everything I hoped this place would stand for." David looked around the room at the mix of shame and surprise on his employees' faces. "Effective immediately, Linda is being promoted to assistant manager," he announced. "She will help me create a training program to ensure that every single person who walks through our doors receives the respect and kindness they deserve." He turned his attention back to the group as a whole. "As for the rest of you, you have a choice to make. You can recommit to treating every customer like they matter, or you can find jobs elsewhere. There will be no second chances for discrimination, no excuses for treating people badly based on their appearance." Robert raised his hand tentatively. "Mr. David, I'm so sorry, I had no idea. I never thought about how it felt from the customer's perspective. Can I have a chance to do better?" David studied the young man's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "Robert, you questioned whether I could afford an $18 meal and wrote cheap guy on my order ticket. But I can see that you understand now why that was wrong. Everyone will get one chance to prove they can change, but the change has to be real." Over the next hour, David implemented new policies based on Linda's suggestions. Every customer would be greeted within 2 minutes of being seated. Every table would receive the same quality of food and service. Staff members would be rotated through different sections to prevent the development of premium and discount areas. Most importantly, David instituted a program where customers could purchase meals for others who might be struggling financially. Linda would oversee this program, ensuring that help was offered with dignity and respect. 6 months later, Angelo's kitchen had transformed into everything David had originally dreamed it could be. The story of his undercover experience had spread throughout the community, bringing in customers who wanted to support a business that truly valued all people. Linda thrived in her new role, training new employees in the art of genuine hospitality. Several of the original staff members, including Robert, had grown into caring servers who understood that their job was about more than just taking orders. And David never forgot the lesson he learned that night, that sometimes the most important truths can only be discovered when you're willing to see the world through someone else's eyes.